Under these conditions, diseases proliferated. To the long list of pre-industrial diseases, industrialization added new ailments. Rickets, a bone disease caused by lack of sunshine, became endemic in dark and smoky industrial cities. Steamships Steamships brought cholera from India, causing great epidemics that struck poor neighborhoods especially hard. Observers documented the horrors of slum life in vivid detail. Their shocking reports led to municipal reforms, such as garbage removal, water and sewage systems, and parks and schools. These measures began to alleviate the ills of urban life after the mid 19th century. Rural environments. Long before the Industrial Revolution began, practically no wilderness areas were left in Britain and very few in Western Europe. Almost every piece of land was covered with fields, forests, or pastures shaped by human activity, or by its towns. Yet humans continue to alter the environment. As they had been doing for centuries, people cut timber to build ships and houses, to heat homes and manufacture bricks, iron, glass, beer, bread, and many other items. North Americans transformed their environment faster than Europeans because they saw nature as an obstacle to be overcome and dominated. The Canadian and American governments seized land from the Native Americans and made it available at low cost to white farmers and logging companies. Settlers viewed forests not as a valuable resource, but as a hindrance to development. In their haste to open up the wilderness, pioneers felled trees and burned them, built houses and abandoned them, and moved on. The cultivation of cotton in the South was especially harmful. Planters cut down forests, grew cotton for a few years until it depleted the soil, then moved west, abandoning the land to scrub pines. In Europe, environments in Europe. In Europe, raw materials once grown on the land, such as wood, hay, and wool, were replaced by materials found underground, like iron ore and coal, or obtained overseas, like cotton. While forested countries continued to smelt iron with charcoal, Western Europeans substituted coke made from coal. As the population increased and land grew scarcer, the cost of growing feed for horses rose, creating incentive to find new, less land-hungry means of transportation. Likewise, as iron became cheaper and wood more expensive, ships and many other objects formerly made of wood began to be made of iron. To contemporaries, the most obvious changes in rural life were brought about by the new transportation systems. In the 18th century, France had a network of quality roads, which Napoleon extended into Italy and Germany. In Britain, local governments' neglect of the roads that served long distance traffic led to the formation of private turnpike trusts that built numerous toll roads. The growing volume of heavy freight triggered canal building booms in Britain, France, and the Low Countries in the late 18th century. Some canals, like the Duke of Bridgewater's Canal in England, connected coal mines to towns or navigable rail rivers. Others linked navigable rivers and created national transportation networks. Canals were where engineers learned skills they were able to apply to the next great transportation system, the railroads. They laid track across rolling country by cutting deeply into hillsides and erecting daringly long bridges across valleys. Soon, trains pulled by puffing, smoking, belching locomotives were invading long, isolated districts. Working conditions. Industrialization offered new opportunities to the enterprising. Carpenters, metalworkers, and mechanists were in great demand. Some workers became engineers or went into business for themselves. The boldest Britons moved to the European continent, the Americas, or India, using their skills to establish new industries. The successful, however, were a minority. Most industrial jobs were unskilled, repetitive, and boring. Factory work did not vary with the seasons or the time of day, but began and ended by the clock. Gaslighting expanded the working day past sunset. See Environment and Technology Gaslighting. Work days were long. There were few breaks, and foremen watched constantly. Workers who performed one simple task over and over had little sense of achievement or connection to the final product. Industrial accidents were common and could ruin a family. Factory workers had no control over their tools, jobs, or working hours. Woman and industry. Industrial work had a major impact on woman and family life. Women who could not afford servants had always worked, but mostly within the family. Spinning and weaving, sewing hats and clothes, preparing food, washing, and doing a myriad of other household chores. In rural areas, women also did farm work, especially caring for gardens and small animals. In the early years of industrialization, even when factory work was available, it was never the main occupation of working women. Most young women who sought paid employment became domestic servants in spite of the low pay, drudgery, and risk of sexual abuse by male employers. Women with small children tried hard to find work they could do at home, such as laundry, sewing, embroidery, millinery, or taking in lodgers. Those who worked in factories were concentrated in textile mills because textile work required less strength than metalworking, construction, or hauling. On average, women earned one third to one half as much as men. The economist Andrew Ure wrote in 1835, "It is in fact the constant aim and tendency of every improvement in machinery to supersede human labor altogether or to diminish its cost, by substituting the industry of women and children for that of men." Young unmarried women worked in to support themselves or to save for marriage. Married women took factory jobs when their husbands were unable to support the family. Mothers of infants faced a hard choice, whether to leave their babies with wet nurses at great expense or bring them to the factory and keep them drugged. Husbands and wives increasingly worked in different places. As in pre-industrial societies, parents thought children should contribute to their upkeep as soon as they were able to. The first generations of workers brought children as young as 5 or 6 with them to the factories and mines. There were no public schools or daycare centers. Employers preferred child workers because they were cheaper and more docile than adults and were better able to tie broken threads or crawl under machines to sweep the dust. In Arkwright's cotton mill, 2/3 of the workers were children. Children worked 14 to 16 hours a day and were beaten if they made mistakes or fall asleep. Mine operators used children to pull coal carts along the low passageways from the coal face to the mine shaft. In the early 19th century, Americans still remembered their revolutionary ideals. When Francois Cabot Lowell built a when Francis Cabot Lowell built a cotton mill in Massachusetts, he hired the unmarried daughters of New England farmers, promising them decent wages and housing in dormitories under careful moral supervision. Other manufacturers, eager to combine profits with morality, followed his example, but soon the profit motive won out, and manufacturers imposed longer hours, harsher working conditions, and lower wages. When the young women went on strike, the mill owners replaced them with Irish immigrants willing to accept lower pay and worse conditions. Industry and slavery. While the cotton boom enriched planters, merchants, and manufacturers, African Americans paid for it with their freedom. In the 1790s, 700,000 slaves of African descent lived in the United States. As the Cotton Kingdom expanded, the number of slaves rose, and by 1850 there were 30.2 million slaves in the United States, 60% of whom grew cotton. Similarly, demand for sugar prolonged slavery in the plantations of the West Indies and caused it to spread to the coffee growing regions of southern Brazil. Slavery was not, as white American Southerners maintained, a peculiar institution, a consequence of biological differences or biblical injunctions, but part of the Industrial Revolution. Changes in society. In his novel Sibyl, or The Two Nations, the British politician Benjamin Disraeli, 1804 to 1881, spoke of two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, the rich and the poor. Handloom weavers and factory workers. In Britain, the worst off were those who clung to an obsolete skill or craft. The high wages and low productivity of handloom weavers in the 1790s induced inventors to develop power looms. As a result, by 1811, handloom weavers' wage had fallen by a third. By 1832, by two-thirds. Even by working longer hours, they could not escape destitution. The standard of living of factory workers did not decline steadily like those of handloom weavers, but fluctuated wildly. Improvements and setbacks. During the war years of 1792 to 1815, the price of food, on which the poor spent most of their income, rose faster than wages, causing widespread hardship. Then, in the 1820s, real wages and public health began to improve. Prices fell and wages rose. Even the poor could afford comfortable, washable cotton cloth and underwear. Hard times returned to the Hungry Forties. In 1847 through 1848, the potato crop failed in Ireland. One quarter of the Irish population died in the resulting famine, and another quarter emigrated to England and North America. The new middle class. The real beneficiaries of the early Industrial Revolution were the middle class. In Britain, landowning gentry and merchants had long shared wealth and influence. In the late 18th century, a new group arose, entrepreneurs whose money came from manufacturing. Most, like Arkwright and Wedgwood, were the sons of middling shopkeepers, craftsmen, or farmers. Their enterprises were usually self-financed, for little capital was needed to start a cotton spinning or machine building business. A generation later, in the 19th century, some newly rich industrialists bought their way into high society. The same happened in Western Europe after 1815. Middle-class women and middle-class attitudes. Before the Industrial Revolution, wives of merchants had often participated in the family business. Widows occasionally managed sizable businesses on their own. With industrialization came a cult of domesticity to justify removing middle-class women from contact with the business world. Instead, they became responsible for the home, the servants, the education of children, and family social life. See Chapter 26. Not all women accepted the change. Mary Wollstonecraft, who lived 1759 through 1797, wrote the first feminist manifesto, Vindication of the Rights of Woman, in 1792. Middle-class people who attributed their success to their own efforts and virtues believed that in some people could succeed through hard work, thrift, and temperance, then those who did not succeed had no one but themselves to blame. Many workers, however, were newly arrived from rural districts and earned too little to save for the long stretches of unemployment they experienced. The squalor of misery of life in factory towns led to a noticeable increase in drunkenness on paydays. The moral position of the middle class mingled condemnation with concern, coupled with feelings of helplessness in the face of terrible social problems such as drunkenness, prostitution, and child abandonment. Section Review. The Industrial Revolution changed people's lives and the environments in which they lived. Mass migrations made cities grow huge and, for the most their inhabitants, unsightly and unhealthy. Roads, canals, and railroads crisscrossed open land, changing rural environments. Middle-class women were consigned to caring for the home and children, while many working-class women had to earn their living in mines and factories. Serious social problems arose, such as unemployment, alcoholism, and the abandonment of children.